My name is Walter Edwards. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and I'm sometimes at the end of a movie, you get the credits, but then lots of people, as soon as the last scene is completed, they run for the exit, so they don't hear what the credits are. So I do want to start out by giving absolute credit to Professor Elizabeth Lublin of the History Department for making this project happen. She experienced virtual book launches as she went to conferences and other places. And as a member of our advisory board, when I asked about novel projects that we can have, she told us about it. And then I asked her to put together something for the board to consider. She did that. The board accepted it immediately. And then she took complete control of it, helped us to devise the ad and the flyer, and made contacts with various places to see what we should have in the ad, and then helped us to put together a flyer to advertise the project, and then spoke with the authors and that we selected, and has been the most important person in this project. And so I'm deeply grateful to her for that. I'm deeply grateful to the advisory board for having the wisdom of selecting this project. I've had tons and tons of emails from people across campus saying that this is a winner. This is something that the Humanities Center is doing that people would really like. So, so I'm happy about that. I'm thankful to the several authors who submitted their books for review. And it was a tough choice to pick these two for this semester. So I thank those. And then I thank Kennedy, Cockrell, and the rest of my staff for doing their best in advertising this project and the one that is going to be aired on the 19th. We sent invitations everywhere we can think of within the university and outside of the university. Kennedy should be given specific credit for putting together the flyer and communicating with Professor Lublin about it. And that the rest of my staff, including my right-hand person, is Tiffin Carter, who is our administrative assistant and who is here working to admit people and other things. And we have 4 College Work Studies students who have been doing the work of posting flyers across the internet. So I thank all of you, and I thank this audience that have so far come. This is a tough week. It's the week of Passover, and it's Holy Week for observant Christians and so on, and that might inhibit some people from being able to make it. But I thank you all for coming. And now that's the last you'll hear from me. I turn everything over to the chair of these proceedings, Professor Elizabeth Lublin.
Thank you very much for that. I was thinking I should have called my mother up because she would have been beaming with how kind you were, Walter, with that introduction. In reverse, I do thank the Humanities Center for making this possible. This is a new initiative for the Humanities Center, in part taking advantage of Zoom and the capabilities of getting together in this means. But we're hoping that this is a program that the Humanities Center will be able to continue moving forward, especially because it provides us the opportunity to introduce the scholarship of really cutting edge faculty at Wayne State in the humanities, not just to the immediate community at Wayne State and in the Metro Detroit area, but as Steve himself, our moderator for today, is representative of the fact that we can tap into people in different time zones and draw different kinds of constituencies, and even further than promote the scholarship, the research, and publications of our faculty. So thank you, Walter. Thank you, the Humanities Center. Thank you especially to my colleague Bill Lynch in the History Department, and to Steve Fuller for their help actually in setting this up. They were key in some negotiations about how we would function today, since this is our very first one. I don't want to call you all guinea pigs, but in essence, you are all sort of guinea pigs. But I hope you don't take offense with that. Anyway, so I don't want to take up too much more time, since the focus here really I want it to be on Bill's very recent publication, Minority Report: Dissent and Diversity in Science. Bill, as I said, is a colleague of mine in the history department. The book itself, recently published by Rowman and Littlefield, very hot off the presses. Some review articles should be coming out I think fairly quickly, in journals and whatnot, blogs, various outlets that are specific to science and technology studies, social epistemology, whatnot. So I wanted to thank Bill for sharing his work with us today. And I also wanted to thank Steve Fuller from across the Atlantic for agreeing to be our moderator, as you might have seen from the chair, or from the flyer. He is the August Comp Chair in Social Epistemology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. He is also a very prolific scholar in science and technology studies. His most recent book explored the challenges that transhumanists are facing today, which is particularly timely given that we've been in a pandemic for just over a year. Before I turn things over to Bill and Steve, I just wanted to give you a rundown of how we were going to progress today. The plan is to start with maybe 20 or 25 minutes of a kind of book chat between Steve and Bill, where Steve will pose some questions. They'll engage in a conversation about Bill's work. I think Bill might have picked a passage or two to read from the book. This is to provide all of us with more information, since I'm not quite sure how many of us have had an opportunity to read this recent publication. And then we're going to shift to a question and answer. I was originally thinking that maybe what we would do is to do the question and answer all in the chat. But let me start with that. And if we find as we move in that actually raising hands once we get to the question and answer actually works a little bit better, we can shift to that. But for right now, plan on posing your questions in the chat. And once I get a sign from Bill that he's ready to move to that portion for today, then I will go through the questions posted in the chat from the first on. So if that all sounds good, I will turn things over to Steve and Bill. And again, thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your thoughts today.
Okay, thank you very much, Betsy, for setting this up. And Bill and I will be kind of having a conversation about this book for 20 minutes, as you say, 20, 25 minutes maybe. Because we imagine that people are going to come in with rather diverse backgrounds, you know, in a sense, what I'd like to do in the beginning is to kind of give a sort of general framing of, you know, the conversations that Bill's work is talking to, because I do think, in a sense, it's really important. The book is quite important, I think, very timely, but it's also very much steeped in a lot of discussions that have been taking place with regard to the changing status of science and society, basically over the last 50 years, I would say. So from the Cold War into the present day. In a sense, so in that respect, the book is very relevant, but it approaches the matters very much from the standpoint of the history, philosophy, and sociology of science. So I think the first thing to say, as a kind of framing device, is that the role of science has changed. And in particular, it's become much more important, and certainly since the Cold War, it's become quite unequivocally the sort of flagship knowledge enterprise. And we're talking about the natural sciences as setting kind of the standard here, and in particular physics, okay? And this influenced kind of the way in which the entire culture, and certainly the way philosophy thought about science. And in a sense, the way science goes, society goes, right? And I think that's a very important kind of background sort of understanding here. And so then so then you have to start saying, okay, science is obviously very important, very powerful. It makes a big difference. It's been involved in the transformation of society and the human condition. So what's so special about science, right? What's so special about science is a form of knowledge. And when philosophers get involved in this, they're looking, as it were, for best practice, you might say, right? So there's going to be a certain kind of critical angle already built into the understanding of science, in that not everything scientists do is perfect. Not everything is great. Science can be compromised. And there's a sense in which part of what philosophy of science, no matter what school we're talking about, so we can be talking about, someone who is relatively politically indifferent, like Thomas Kuhn, who's very famous, right, with the structure of scientific revolutions, or we can be talking about Karl Popper and his people, who are very kind of clearly identified with a kind of liberal, anti-communist sort of thing, or we can be talking about Marxists. Right. I mean, all of these people, are very much, of the opinion, right, that there's a kind of best practice of science, and that tells us something about knowledge in society. And they hold somewhat different views on the matter. And the problem, of course, is in the last 50 years, science's role in the world has radically changed, and not always in a way that has made science look great. Okay, so we can talk about, the 2 world wars, we can talk about the Cold War, we can talk about the current situation that we're in now, where science, in a sense, is very much kind of the wild card with regard to a lot of different sorts of interests, corporate interests, particular interests, things like this. And so then the question becomes, how do we evaluate whether science is working well? Because it matters to all of us. And this is where Bill's book comes in, I think. It comes in this kind of conversation, which the people in the field in which we've been trained, which is the history, philosophy, and sociology of science, which nowadays tends to be called science and technology studies, right? We sort of, we know this background, right? We sort of understand where all this is coming from. And in some way, we need some sort of overall judgment, you might say, that might actually be of some political relevance in terms of how we go forward with science in the future. And so the issue, I would say, that in a sense crystallizes Bill's interest in this book, right, is the one that's suggested in the title, Minority Report, right? So we're talking in a way about the status of dissenting views, okay? And there's lots of them in science, right? And some of them, over the course of time become, as it were, the vanguard of what might be revolutionary changes in the way in which science operates. And others are kind of cranks or in some way deformations of science or whatever. And this has been a preoccupation of the philosophy of science throughout this whole period, right? Everyone's concerned about this issue, and it's an issue that ought to be of concern to us today, because it has political implications in terms of what gets taught in schools, in terms of our funding, right? In terms of our everyday practice. Obviously, in terms of the pandemic, it makes a difference, right? For example, whether wearing masks matters or doesn't matter, right? I mean, and there's going to be dominant views and minority views in all of these issues. So how do you resolve them? Okay. And this is the question, you might say, that Bill's book is addressing, but addressing it in a very deep kind of way. That is to say, taking quite seriously the past history and sociology of science and the philosophy of science, and looking at the various kinds of alternatives that are there. And so the first question I want to put to you, Bill, in light of all that, is what is your distinctive contribution? What is your distinctive as it were, contribution to this kind of debate, which you're clearly trying to say something about? How would you put it in a nutshell, in a way that people sort of see the difference of your position?
Yeah, I think the key issue is that science changes, broadly speaking, dialectically. That is to say, it changes with respect to its past history. And that you can't understand science by talking about issues like proof, which we might be inclined to look to, or consensus. These are some of the answers to the questions that Steve has been raising that are out there in the literature now. Climate change, right? How do you judge what we should do about climate change and the status of climate change? One popular view is that we just look at the consensus. And in this case, the consensus is rather remarkable and unusual in a way, in the sense that there is a great number, that if you look at the peer-reviewed literature, there's little or no dissenting views, right? And to the overall picture of anthropogenic climate change. However, that's not entirely a good answer, right? Because in the history of science, and this was something that two of the key figures that I talk about, Imre Lakatos and Paul Feyerabend, always emphasize, there's always dissenting views. So how can we make sense of this where we do not simply just rely on consensus? Because in the early 17th century, that would have probably been, if not endorsing Ptolemaic astronomy, perhaps it would be Tycho Brahe's astronomy, but it certainly wouldn't have been Galileo or Copernicus's astronomy. And so what I did, in a sense, was to go back and reconsider two figures who were precisely concerned about this particular issue of the extent to which you should trust science, but they didn't want to do it the way Thomas Kuhn did. So Thomas Kuhn basically said, and Steve Fuller has written a lot about this, that you defer to the experts. In that view, still very dominant in our field. It's perhaps most clearly seen in the sociologist of science, Harry Collins, who basically tells you, it's only a slight paraphrase, shut up and listen to your doctor. Don't go on Dr. Google. Don't try to look things up that differ from what someone said, what your doctor told you. Go by the reliable consensus. And how do you know what the consensus is for him? You can't even look it up anywhere. You have to ask the experts. Well, how do you know what the experts are? Well, the experts will have to tell you that. And among the experts, some of the experts know that some of the so-called experts are not really experts. It's a very, very, very circular kind of way of looking at things. And I don't want to say that there's not a point to it, right? In science, we have to trust the expertise of others. And this is a big theme within science and technology studies. But do we trust it without any guardrails? And who do we trust? So that's why I went back and looked at two figures that were highly influential philosophers of science that have kind of dropped by the wayside. And they dropped by the wayside sort of because they were sort of seen as no longer the cutting edge. And one was Imre Lakatos, and he came from Hungary and ended up in working with Karl Popper and others in England. And he's remembered as an internalist. An internalist basically tells you that science is insulated from society when properly done, assuming there's not a dictator like Stalin or Hitler around. Then science can get on with its business and solve its own problems on its own terms, and it's internally driven. He spent a lot of time arguing with another Central European philosopher, Austrian Paul Feyerabend, who ended up in the US and elsewhere. And they exchanged a lot of arguments and discussion about this issue. And he's remembered more as a relativist because he was, quote, against method. And if you look at the critical history of what these people actually said, going back, there's now a whole body of literature on this, it becomes pretty clear that Lakatos was not really an internalist and Feyerabend was not really a relativist, at least in the usual sense of those terms. And despite their extreme differences, they had planned on writing a book for and against method. They actually have a very common view, which is drawing upon dialectical philosophy. Imre Lakatos got it more or less from Lucasian Marxism in Hungary, and Feyerabend actually drew a lot on Trotsky and Lenin in some of his writings. Neither one was really a Marxist by the time they became famous. Imre Lakatos was a kind of Cold War right-winger, and Paul Feyerabend was kind of like not entirely left-leaning person responding to some of the changes in the 60s. So anyway, that's the key idea I think I want to get across, is that they both looked at how science changed over time such that there was a dynamic process to science that went somewhere. And you don't look at how a particular slice of time for science corresponds to the world. Instead, you look at whether science continues to be fruitful and what you need to do to make it fruitful if it gets stuck in a jam.
Okay, let's tease that out a little bit, because one of the things that's pretty clear in the book is that, and this is where you disagree with Feyerabend is very famous in philosophy of science for a so-called anything goes philosophy, where basically all dissenting views, just endlessly proliferating, right? I mean, 1,000 flowers bloom. He even used that phrase at one point. And so he's often known as, he called himself an epistemological anarchist, right? Which is closer that, he's not a relativist. Bill's absolutely right. But you can sort of, but the point is he believed that in a sense, people should just be pursuing inquiry in whatever way they want. Now, he didn't say much about how you actually resolve the differences between these different things. But then at the end of the day, Feyerabend believed that the biggest problem was the concentration of power in science by the state, right? So part of, you got to get the kind of Feyerabend picture, right? The fact that you've got the state as the monopoly shareholder in science, right? We're talking about the Cold War primarily in the 1970s. Right, that in fact, this means that, whatever view is dominant is permanently dominant because all the money goes there, right? So he's not imagining a world, which is kind of like the world we live in now, where basically you have something much more like a market environment, where basically you've got lots of players and the ones with the most money pull the science in different directions. Feyerabend is actually imagining a world where, whether we're talking about the United States or the Soviet Union, the monopoly of power, in terms of controlling where science goes is through the state, right? Through the defense budget, basically, right? In the peak of the Cold War, 2/3 of all science funding in the United States was through defense budget, okay? People forget about this stuff now. But this is kind of where the anarchism of Feyerabend comes from. It comes from as a reaction to a very strong statism, right? Where you can talk about alternative points of views as actively suppressed, right? In the sense that there's no money for them, right? They are blocked, and they might even be seen as dangerous and destabilizing to national security, right? So this is the Cold War. Again, some of you seem to be old enough to remember the Cold War, right? This is in fact, the way it was. And so Feyerabend is kind of really pushing back strongly against this. But we don't live in this world, right? And so in a sense, what Bill is trying to do in the book is in a way to reconfigure these kinds of discussions that guys like Lakatos and Feyerabend were having, right, in the 60s and 70s, right, and into this world, where it's much more complicated what's going on exactly, right, in terms of how something becomes a dominant science and how it maintains itself and so forth. And so with that in mind, Bill, obviously there are lots of views floating around now that claim to be suppressed, oppressed, right? They're dissenting from the majority. There are lots of them out there, and you just have to go on Google to find them, right? As you were alluding to earlier. Well, then in your way of thinking about things, how do you tell the difference between the sheep and the goats, right? In other words, which dissenters ought you be supporting and which ones ought you not be supporting? So can you flesh that out a little bit?
Yes, and I think I do that a little bit by reframing what Lakatos and Feyerabend were up to in terms of, from Lakatos's side, it's sort of an objection to anomaly mongering. So what I mean by that is that it's very easy if you go online, as Steve talks about, and you can find a challenge to anything that you want to do in terms of science-based policy or in terms of believing any particular body of science. And I think when I started graduate school in science and technology studies, that was not the case. We were looking at a time when people would take for granted that science had a certain kind of expertise. There might be certain kinds of objections here and there. And one of the purposes of our field was to tease out the limitations of science as it existed and science as it was funded. But Lakatos, in a sense, lays down certain rules for how to recognize when someone is making progress. And progress is not quite the way we think about it in terms of a unilateral march to the truth. In fact, Lakatos, it turns out, clearly rejected that idea that there was some kind of link to the between our particular theories and an underlying reality. Post-Hegel, impossible. And so the way he understood this, even applying it in some of his work to mathematics, was that really what you want to look at are the moves that get you somewhere from where you are. So he broke science down into different research programs. And then he said, look, some research programs don't generate the next theory in the series in a way that leads to new predictions, some of which may be true. And so with that kind of simple model, in the first chapter, I look at the climate change issue. And when you do that, it looks like that since the end of the 19th century, really the history goes back quite a ways, the idea that human emissions are causing climate change from very simple models initially and now very complex computer models, predictions are made that by and large, they don't have to all be right all the time, but they tend to accumulate predictions that turn out to be the case. And Feyerabend challenged a lot of this. And so when Steve says that he was an epistemological anarchist, that's true. If you look at the roots of that, though, what he was trying to do was to advance that same kind of critical thinking where you're able to take a particular view and then say, well, this minority view doesn't yet have, everything going for it, but it should have an opportunity. And so he went further down the road in trying to find this way to spur a given science. In the early 60s, he was arguing with Thomas Kuhn. They both agreed that different scientific perspectives saw the world in different ways, and that might create problems of communication. But Feyerabend argued, look, if you don't force an outside view on the dominant view, sometimes you may get stuck. He famously talked about that in terms of thermodynamics and the kinetic theory of heat. Basically, if you imagine that heat is a bunch of little atoms, that's the minority view. You're not going to be able to show that to thermodynamic scientists that are measuring things with instruments that are macroscopic. And so he said, in science, sometimes you have to invent a different observation language. He even used the term later on, counterinduction. Aristotle says objects fall to the earth, and this, we can just literally observe this, and so therefore the earth must be motionless. Well, how do you oppose that? Not by more observation, but by changing the conception of what that observation was. So Feyerabend went a little bit further in suggesting that a particular approach that did not have a lot going for it now should be considered. And by the 70s, he was kind of saying, maybe you should, the same way we credit science with knowledge based upon assumptions that scientists bring to bear upon the world, maybe we could do the same thing with witchcraft or with creationism or things like that, things that he would then get in trouble with for bringing it up in his philosophy of science class at Berkeley. But so the bottom line is they differed on how far you want to go in considering this. But a start is to consider whether or not a view is predicting facts that tend to be confirmed, and more to the point, is it generating the next step within science? So some examples that I give in the book talk about you can criticize a mainstream approach by showing how a particular class of phenomena they talk about can be understood in a new way that leads to new insights. And that's different from anomaly mongering, which is just saying there's these things that are not explained. Kuhn, Lakatos, and Feyerabend all understood that mature sciences have things that are not explained, anomalies, and they will never go away in human science. So we can't base a criticism or a defense of any particular scientific theory by whether or not something has proven everything. Proof is not the way to go. They called it people that were trying to be justificationists, and they believed in conjecturalists. It's a perfectly good standing to support a minority view, even if it's weak, but you just have to kind of admit what the limitations are.
I want to ask, I would like to go one more round before we open, because we have one question up there and we're getting to about 20 minutes, but I want to go one more round on this. In a way, I'm not sure you directly address this in the book, but it seems to me this is quite relevant in terms of how this question I'm going to ask is relevant in terms of how history actually relates to these kinds of issues we're talking about. One of the things, so people will probably be familiar with Thomas Kuhn's view from the Structure of Scientific Revolutions about the way in which science progresses, if you want to call it that, how it changes over time. And the very striking thing about his view is the fact that we have basically a succession of paradigms, as he calls them, and paradigms are winner-take-all things. Okay, so in a sense, a new paradigm claims all the previous successes, no matter who came up with them, right? So in a sense, this is how science has a very clear focus in terms of its historical narrative, right? So in a sense, even though there might be disagreement at certain points in the history of science, they all get resolved and the winner takes it all, right? And as it were, the dissenters disappear. They either get absorbed into the new establishment or they just go off, maybe found another discipline or become cranks or whatever, right? But Kuhn's view is this kind of, it's a very smooth kind of story, and he has this kind of way of talking about the function of the history of science within science. That is to say, the history of science that scientists learn, right? Which is to continue this kind of sense of winner take all, over time, right? That in the end, it all gets resolved. We all agree on something. And this keeps the consensus idea going, right? So you get this sense, and this is where people get this idea that there's something quite trustworthy about consensus in science, because in a sense, it represents the resolution of all the differences. And if you're not incorporated in the new consensus, there's something wrong with you, basically, right? I mean, this is kind of Kuhn's view. I put it a little bit, sensationalistically, but this is pretty much the view. And people like Popper, Lakatos, Feyerabend, all these guys who spent a lot of time arguing against Kuhn in the 60s and 70s, they notice this, right? And this is kind of what they're against, right? But it does raise a kind of issue, it seems to me, because in a sense, there is something kind of true about, as a realpolitik of how science self-understands, right? That's in Kuhn. And so then the problem becomes, how do you identify, as it were, what properly belongs to the dominant paradigm and what properly belongs to the dissenters, if perhaps a lot of the dissenting stuff, especially if the dissenters have been around for a long time, have been appropriated by the dominant view? Okay? So we could talk, for example, I mean, in the book, you spent a little bit of time talking about Darwinism and the various debates that Darwinian evolution has faced from various sides, not just the creationists, but also people who want a kind of extended synthesis, epigeneticists, kind of neo-Lamarckian type stuff, right? You entertain a lot of these sort of issues. And so in the history of biology, it is, it's quite clear, right, from a historical standpoint, that people who hold all sorts of different background metaphysical views about God, about nature, everything, right, contributed. They all contributed, right? They contributed, and usually their contributions are known as factual contributions, right? And they're stripped of the metaphysics that they perhaps brought to the table, right? That's gone, but the facts remain, and now they are all colonized by Darwinists, because the Darwinists are the dominant guys. And so the people who still hold the metaphysical views of those old scientists from the 19th century, like the ones who discovered dinosaurs, but thought dinosaurs were only around for a couple of thousands of years, I mean, those people, right, the people who hold those metaphysical views are not allowed to take credit for the empirical observations that those metaphysical views led to in the 19th century, right? They're just called creationists, right? They're just called creationists. And in some sense, they have to rebuild their view from scratch. Because at least this is the impression one gets from your book, right? Because part of your argument, as I understand it, is that the way that you judge the relative standing of dissenting views, how seriously we should take them, is in terms of their track record, right? I mean, you make a big deal about, and that different views have different track records in terms of what they generate. But then it becomes very important to actually identify the alternative traditions properly and what exactly you give them credit for. And the problem with the way in which we conceptualize science is this winner-take-all thing, where in a sense the dominant view gets credit for all the empirical stuff and nobody else can take credit for it. And and this seems to me kind of quite problematic in a way. And I'm just wondering, because in your book you don't really tackle that issue. You sort of assume that dissenting views in a sense have been oppressed and that they're in some sense radically other to the establishment. And it's not clear to me that that's really true. Though, of course, the rhetoric is one of oppression, but nevertheless, what's happened before then is that a lot of the good stuff from the alternative traditions have been appropriated.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying, right? And so I'm just saying, so this raises an interesting issue about the way in which history operates critically, potentially, in terms of trying to figure out what exactly, belongs to the dissenting traditions and what exactly belongs to the dominant traditions. I mean, it's a bit complicated, but I hope you see what I'm saying here, because I think this is kind of in a way to kind of open up how we identify different positions in terms of dominant and dissenting. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, part of that, during the 1960s, Lakatos and Feyerabend were comparing notes about how they were both followers of Hegel and Marx, something that they certainly Lakatos didn't admit very explicitly. And what connected them to that was nothing really politically, but really this exact issue of how science transforms its past in a way that makes it distinct and therefore, no longer directly comparable to what went on in the past, right? So, I mean, my short answer is that a view that loses will be out in the cold until it can organize an alternative way that engages and reprocesses that history in a way that allows them to move forward. And really, this goes back to Pierre Duhem and other physicists, philosophers of the turn of the 19th to 20th century that really were trying to address exactly that. Should you see the science as building up a metaphysical picture of the world, or should you see it as really just indicating various laws, and we really don't know where that process is going to lead? And Duhem crucially tried to argue that the problem is that the metaphysics would not be consensual. You couldn't get agreement within science on the underlying structure of the world, in his case, whether there are atoms underlying everything or not, right? But you could take the science that described a particular phenomenon and use it to move on to better and better descriptions of that world, predictions. And so Duhem's really the source for a lot of people I talk about. Lakatos and Feyerabend both thought that Popper stole from Duhem. They borrowed from him. Otto Neurath, who I talk about in chapter 5, borrowed from him. Basically, the common theme here was that science begins to understand by the early 20th century that that there's something about science that transforms one's starting point metaphysically and alters it, right? So one can't stop it and make it and then talk about, well, what's the basis for whether or not we believe in evolution or some alternative account, right? So perhaps part of the problem that might address your question, Steve, is that it's really not an issue of, for instance, if I am much more enthusiastic about a thoroughly materialist and Darwinian explanation of the world than you are, whether or not I have more evidence than you have evidence for, right, at a slice in time. But more of the issue is, how does a view that's dominant get changed and sometimes make comebacks? So I'll give one example from my book, which is the debate about group selection. Charles Darwin tried to explain evolution by natural selection, primarily in terms of individuals, but he did admit two alternative explanations. One is that, because of something called altruism. So imagine you're a bird and a prey animal is coming towards you and is about to consume you. You chirp and warn the others in your group, but that predator then eats the bird, right? So how can a trait to cause a warning signal survive in evolution? And Darwin gave two very sketchy answers to that. One was kin selection and one was group selection. And the kin selection argument is, well, you've got relatives, right? So some of your genes will survive, to use the language that later on would be used of the selfish gene. And then the other alternative view was the group. You're selecting for the group. Well, in the middle, with the rise of the modern synthesis in biology and a genetic understanding of what went on, group selection went out. They showed that there was it literally couldn't function as a proper explanation in the way that it was proposed. Kin selection could. So there's something called inclusive fitness, where an individual will try to advance themselves by, promoting, staying alive and reproducing, but also helping those that they're related to stay alive and reproduce. Okay, now this blows up into a big political argument as well as a scientific argument, literally in the Department of Biology at Harvard University in the 70s. So on the one hand, you got E.O. Wilson, who invents or helps invent or helps package this kin selection idea under the name of social biology. And the accusations was that this brought with it a whole host of politics. So the metaphysics is, this is bad stuff. These are society, human nature is dark. People just are out for themselves. And if they cooperate to any extent, it's just to help their kin. In the context of the cultural politics of the 1970s, this was explosive. So the Marxist biologists, Stephen Jay Gould and company, came back at that and said that that's not the case. You have a very narrow view of this. And they made some hints about group selection, but that really only came later on, because what they were doing at the time was kind of fending them off by saying humans are different, they have culture. Somehow we evolved these kinds of social brains, and the culture is its own thing. Later on, they repackaged that idea of group selection in a way that didn't run afoul of the problems that the earlier theory of group selection did. And now you have it in terms of cultural evolution that's spanning a number of the social and natural sciences now. It's still not the dominant view compared to, let's say, evolutionary psychology and surviving biological approaches to human nature. But they battle it out by showing that they can meet the formalism and of the mathematics and so forth, that they can improve their particular theory and then address things that are not explained. Number one thing that are not explained is, how do humans cooperate in these complex societies that we have, where we do not only help our kin? And so that has come back, right, in a way, because it dialectically engaged its opponent and came up with an alternative way to recuperate this. So there is this game of trying to reclaim what evidence you used to have that is no longer credited to you.
So it's very important. Because this example you gave about Harvard in the 1970s, it's very important that the dissenters actually be in the institutionally comparable.
Yes, I think that's a very.
It's not a trivial point, right? It's not a trivial point, because I think that's what actually makes the story work, right? Because if you don't have institutional recognition, right, then you don't get the airtime, basically, right? You're not able to actually engage in these debates, where you could see the two views, and the two views can actually interact in some meaningful fashion. Because
although it was connected to the social movement, right? So you had the political actors, the people that were throwing bottles of water on E.O. Wilson, and
sure, but it was important that E.O. Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould were in the same university, right? I mean, and they were both recognized biologists in their own way, right, for different reasons,
Yes.
from different branches of biology, for sure, right? But nevertheless, they were both respected guys in their respective fields. And one of the problems that I think a lot of the dissenters, that we think about today, right, and some of whom you discuss in the book, is actually there isn't that kind of level playing field of institutional recognition to begin with, which makes it very difficult then for the dissenting views even to get a hearing, right? And this is where you start to get the feeling that there's a conspiracy suppressing dissenting views, because we live in a world today, right, where all dissenting views are victims of conspiracies against them, right? And one of the way, of course, that they get off the ground, these conspiracies, is the fact that usually they're not recognized. The people aren't institutionally recognized for whatever reason, and there are lots of reasons why people aren't institutionally recognized, right? Why can't X find a job in academia when they try, right? There are lots of reasons, right? Lots of answers one gives to that question. But the point is that if you don't actually have a position in academia, right? Because that is pretty much where the level playing field would be established, if anywhere. Then you can't get out of the starting gate if you have a dissenting view. I think, don't you think?
I think that's mostly true. But I give the caveat about social movement. So if you, in chapter 5, I look at, and this is a trendy topic in science and technology studies, to look at activist movements. Stephen Epstein talked about that with AIDS activists who actually were able to penetrate the actual scientific meetings and literature and engage and come up with alternative views with the scientists themselves. They actually may have been working with more cultural capital that, in terms of the cohesiveness of their movement and a relatively high level of education that they had with this. But there's a very common thing now that you can see on the internet that's not quite to the level of, say, Q conspiracies and stuff like that, and rejection of climate change out of hand, but that involve patient movements, right? And these are people that are not treated well in the medical system, and they blame the dominant theory. So in chapter 5, I look at people that are very, very sick from adrenal or thyroid disease. And they tend to believe in something called adrenal fatigue, meaning that the stresses of life have slowly worn them out, and the endocrinologists only want to recognize that there's a very limited condition in which your adrenal function just disappears and you need supplemental treatment. Likewise, the thyroid patients are constantly arguing that they're being mistreated by the medicines that are prescribed and undertreated, whereas the doctors are concerned that overtreatment leads to various types of problems. So they railed about this. They have social movements. There's a website called Stop the Thyroid Madness. It's not run by someone from Harvard, right? I think they brought along some sort of marginal doctors, right? Not people that are mainstream funded, NIH funded researchers, but people that are usually clinicians that are finding some way that they believe is they're treating the patients better. And so these patients, they'll get together and they make these arguments and they go in the literature and they criticize it. And lo and behold, it turns out that in the few scientists that respond to some of these complaints, turn up a few things that are worthy of investigation. First of all, the adrenal fatigue fits with a different science that studies the effects of stress on life, including primates and the role in the stress hierarchy of primates. So there's all kinds of literature about how that destroys your health, right? So we can certainly expect that people with modern stresses might be suffering something that needs looking into a little bit more. But for the thyroid patients, it turns out there's an issue called tissue hypothyroidism. So you give a certain amount of thyroid medicine to a patient, that patient doesn't feel like they're doing any better, but the doctor measures their levels and says, your levels are fine now. Go home. It's all in your head. Maybe it's because you're a woman. Maybe it's because you're depressed, right? And oftentimes these are patients that even to get to the endocrinologist had to go through that with their doctors to even get access to the specialist. And now the specialist is telling them that they're treated, but they don't feel like they're treated. Well, tissue hypothyroidism, to the extent they're beginning to investigate that, suggests that when you measure the levels in the blood, they may not correspond to the levels in the liver or in some other organ, right? So that different areas of the body may be affected differently in a way that the proxy measurements are not reaching, right? So they were able to accomplish a little bit, right? And here's where I would appeal to Feyerabend, because Feyerabend's whole point was you can't let the spontaneous development of science do it. It's not going to do it spontaneously. You have to force the debate, the discussion, and bring things together in a certain kind of way. And I think that was common through all the different stages of Feyerabend's career. And in this case, it really fits. It's not so much that I, as a philosopher and historian of science, am going to endorse one particular view about this debate, but I'm going to say, look, this needs more investigation. We have a prima facie reason why patients are reporting that they're not being treated well by the dominant way of doing things. We have tentative ideas that suggest there's a solution, right? Get at it, right? Don't just continue on in a laissez-faire way. So what's different between Kuhn and Harry Collins today and Feyerabend, Lakatos, and maybe Steve and myself both, is that we don't believe in a laissez-faire approach to science, right? We may differ about the extent to which you bring in different kinds of minority views, but you need to work at it. You need to be explicit at finding a solution.
Yes, and I think this is a good place to end the conversation, except to say that historians of science of Bill's generation and younger are taking up the challenge. So what Bill is describing is actually being done by quite a few people today on all sorts of issues. So this is in a way, his book is giving a kind of theoretical basis, theoretical justification for this much more activist stance that our field is taking than it has in the past.
Absolutely, and I'm drawing on some of that literature. So absolutely.
Yeah. So I see there's one question. How do you want to proceed?
I just want to say that I want to say something, but I don't want to cut in front of the chat people, but I just want to be able to say something in the session.
Okay.
You know, what if I could, since we're a small enough group and it might be a little bit artificial for me to be reading questions off the chat, I will take hands and maybe you could ask the questions then yourself. And so I think we have Eric first and then Bruce, you're up next, all right?
Well, I guess I don't know that I have a coherent question so much as taking it back to Lakatos and Kuhn, people like that.
Thank you.
I tend to give Lakatos a bit of short shrift to teach philosophy of science because I say he doesn't really have a great answer to this question that he's raising as to what's a progressive versus regressive research program. And in you guys' case, the question seems to come to be something like, how do you distinguish the truly crazy hypotheses from ones that deserve more consideration? And both can be coming from outside of the mainstream, so to speak. But, you know, nowadays, nowadays, you know, we can see that hypotheses are coming from right-wing interests that are just completely insane. And so there has to be some kind of way to distinguish hypotheses that have not had enough institutional support to gain good evidence behind them from complete crazy people. And so this is kind of a problem that Lakatos was having. And I'm just wondering, throwing out, maybe you guys don't have an answer. I don't expect that you do, but do you have any questions or do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I think Steve and I may differ the most on this question. Steve has sometimes talked about it. Is that fair to say?
We'll see what you say. We'll see what you say.
Yeah. No, I mean, and this might be the time to thank Steve because he's open to criticism. Karl Popper seemed to be open to criticism, but the followers of Popper were constantly being degraded and insulted by him for stealing his ideas and not coming up with anything new. And so lactose intolerant actually just sort of left that whole community for that reason. They didn't, yeah. And so formal commitment to openness to ideas is not always followed, and Steve is a rare exception. So he's allowed me to criticize certain views of his quite forcefully, and likewise. So I think he has talked about it, for instance, with respect to his argument on behalf of intelligent design, which I talk about briefly in the book, as affirmative action, right? So the view could go further if you could get some support. This is what Steve has brought up before, right? So the question becomes, do you let 1,000 flowers bloom? Well, not if it requires money, right? So this is the difficulty of implementing a strict epistemological anarchist perspective. We can't, just count on that. So that's why I've tried to talk about it in terms of, ways that, in the way that I have. And I think all I would say is that I try to grapple, perhaps not completely successfully, with it in the last chapter, where I am concerned that, let's call it the ecosystem of science that it works within, maybe being eroded in various kinds of ways by the incursion of markets and what science studies people call agnotology, the production of ignorance, the exploitation of uncertainty by corporate players. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. So I think the best thing to do is just to point that out when it occurs, and to insist that we look, and that's why we look at least a tentative track record for understanding when we have something that needs further investigation, but there's actually something to do, right? And I tried to argue not so much at Steve Fuller's own particular views, but by someone else that studied in the history of science later in their career, Stephen Meyer, in Intelligent Design, that you can make a case, as Fuller has, that there are particular anomalies that are unexplained by the Darwinian view that maybe an intelligent design approach would explain. The difficulty is there a research program there? What is the next step that actually investigates it, other than to pointing out that there's not an answer within science now? So that's the first thing. Saying that there's not an answer with science in science now doesn't get you in the door. What you need to do is to show that there's an alternative that can connect with some aspects of modern science. And I argued that if you looked closely at Meyer's argument, it amounted ultimately to the view that intelligence and consciousness couldn't be an object of a rational material science. That ultimately consciousness and intelligence was undivided, and he was basically a philosophical idealist, and not in a way that was tractable to empirical study. So I think it's possible to make these kinds of arguments. I think I give some of the tools to talk about that, which is not to say that everyone will agree in the application of that, right? So the argument can begin, but I don't have a magic bullet for it.
I think we should just move on to because we're not having a debate here. Bill and I aren't having a debate here. I think it's better to move on so people get to hear Bill's views more.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Bruce is next, and then Lisa, I see your hand up.
So I think there are three separate questions, and I'm going to try to address one of them. But the three I see are, how should science proceed? The second one is, what role should, funding and whatnot have in directing science in one way or another? And the third one is, what should we non-scientists think about things about climate change and the like? And that's a separate issue, and it's kind of in the ballpark. But I want to address the question about how science should proceed and leave those other two aside for a moment, because there's lots to say. So first off, I think science is seeking the truth about whatever phenomena it investigates: the origin of the universe, the origin of species, climate change, whatever the phenomena are, it's seeking truth. But unfortunately, we can't get at the truth directly. So what the thing to do, justification requires, the responsible pursuit of the truth. And the responsible pursuit of the truth requires fitting your beliefs to the evidence. But it's not only the evidence you have, but the evidence you might say you should have. And so I think that Feyerabend could be understood as saying, you know, the best means for getting all the relevant evidence is to have 1,000 flowers bloom. Let other people say, give the kind of wild theories about what's going on, and maybe we'll drive people to seek more evidence. And we have more evidence, we have a better basis for a rational belief about what the truth is. Now, Eric brought up this question about crazy theories. How do you rule them out? Well, I think the two basic principles of reason that underlie science are inference of the best explanation and an induction. Some views have a bad track record. Those views that talk about intelligent design and all that stuff, they have a really bad track record in evolutionary theory. They said you couldn't explain certain things. You know, you couldn't explain the origin of the species, or you couldn't explain the complexity of the eye. Hold on, Darwin comes along and says, yes, I can. Oh yeah, but Darwin, you can't explain irreducible complexity. They bring in the example of a mousetrap. If you're missing one part of a wing, it won't fly. How in the heck did wings develop? And Darwin and later people defended function switching. You can't explain life. And now people are trying to do that. What's the story? Why should we discount those kinds of theories? Answer, bad track record. And that's an inductive argument why you should get rid of those. So science should proceed, leaving these things about funding and what we should think about climate change and the origin of the universe and the origin of species aside. Science should seek the truth by fitting the beliefs to the evidence. The reason you abandon the Ptolemaic theory about the origin or the nature of the solar system is more evidence comes in and you no longer have the best explanation of the total evidence. Science should seek the truth and fit its beliefs to the evidence and continue to gather evidence. And it's a good thing as a means that you have challenges from sort of not ones that have bad track records, but they're just kind of not in the mainstream of science. And you should leave your window, if not your door, open to listen to those outsider views about how things are. So that's my view. That's exactly how science, what its aim is to get the truth. What it should do is fit its beliefs to the evidence. Everything else is simple.
That's probably not far off from what I'm trying to say about anomaly mongering. The only maybe emphasis that would be a little bit different in what I would say is that it's a question of the positive case. So with a minority view, Galileo made progress when he didn't so much contest the prior view, because astronomers were well aware, for instance, of the problems of fitting the path of the planets to a Earth-centered universe, right? So the issue, so it's anomalies are not unknown to those in the dominant perspective, but anomalies are always there, right? So to get an alternative view going, Feyerabend suggested sometimes it needs almost an artificial jump start, and that's what he thought Galileo did. Invent almost a different way of talking about what those facts are. He called it counterinduction. He argued that it's to reject literally the facts that the Aristotelians were counting on, such as that objects fall to the center of the Earth, which therefore must be the center of the universe. There was a kind of natural interpretation of the facts that was flawed. How do you show it? Get a completely different language for talking about facts. And the dialogue on the two chief world systems that he wrote was an attempt to do that, as Feyerabend saw, by propaganda and psychological tricks. Well, sometimes you need propaganda and psychological tricks to dislodge a view that actually is very, very accurate to the facts, right? Because it's been adjusted and molded to them based upon assumptions that could be jettisoned, right? So I think that's the only emphasis that maybe is slightly different from what you said, or that I would emphasize in particular, is what is the positive case for the minority view, and how does it lead to something being fruitful, that is generating new work that then can improve on the terms of its own understanding.
Sure, and to me, that's not a philosophical question. It's purely empirical. Let those people speak. How did it go? Did it actually progress science, or did it actually often cause it to go down dead ends? Strictly not philosophical at all. It's completely an empirical question. Is it a good means to progress science or not? Okay.
Lisa?
Yeah, I am really enjoying this. Thanks. And I guess I want to pick up on two of Bruce's questions. The other two. The first of all, the what should non-scientists think? And I was thinking that your method should maybe be part of a civics course. And I was wondering how you bring kind of the ideas from your book into undergraduate education. You know, how do you kind of develop a layperson's methodology for surfing the web, you know, for information? So that was my one. And then the other one about funding, I guess it's just kind of a big question about how science gets around the market environment, how it gets around government, when government's saying, you know, you can't research gun violence, you can't research stem cells, we're not going to give any more money to universities, we're not going to give any more money to grant agencies. I mean, even sitting, you know, on the college tenure committee, I'm just like, how is knowledge supposed to happen if there's no money for it, you know, even at a research university? So yeah, those are my two questions, but thank you for everything so far.
Thanks. Yeah, I think on the first question about pedagogy, the short answer is I teach a science and technology studies course that uses some of the standard books by Collins and Pinch about controversies. They look at scientific controversies and they show that there are these two sides, that in each side makes sense in its own terms, even though one side might be quite marginal to and ultimately have lost out. I also do assign a brief excerpt from the writings of Lakatos and Feyerabend to frame that in terms of the issue of, well, if you're faced with these competing views, what do you do? How do you make a decision? And because sometimes that's what's dropped out of, especially, you know, introductory level discussions of my field. So, I mean, Collins and Pinch consider a case where, you know, maybe fossil fuels are not produced by the way we thought they are, but they're actually a kind of renewable resource. Then they don't take millions of years. And it turns out this was actually a relatively serious hypothesis that was entertained. Well, what do you do if you believe that? And where do you drill and what do you do, right? So I think you have to address it in that kind of way so that you can consider what the practical consequences are of doing this. And how you decide that something is credible enough to move on. I don't think you answer that at the undergraduate level necessarily, but some of the tools, concepts that I talk about drawing from Lakatos and Feyerabend help a little bit with that. The second part was on the
Funding.
Yeah. That's a big question, and I think it's a hugely neglected question in a weird way. I say that in a weird way because there's all kinds of literature in my field about the impact of funding on science, going back to the Medicis and Galileo, right? So we tend to privilege a brief slice of time from the Cold War when you know, certain states started drastically funding science for military purposes, of course, but also funding what they called basic science, which was not directed specifically, so it claimed, at a particular result. And we take that as the model, the default state for science, and I don't think it is. I think it's disappearing in the modern world of what some have called neoliberal science or post-academic science. And I think that's number one, that's a potential problem. Well, number two, science all along perhaps has been limited in ways that we have not yet really begun to fathom. about this. And the problem is that in our field, people do take a laissez-faire approach that look at this. So they say, oh, science has always funded things in different ways. So don't get worried if now, private companies are funding research. It'll be fine, right? And others are saying, maybe not, right? So I think the funding of science has a real impact. Some of my case studies talk about that. Corporate funding by chemical companies clearly altered our understanding of the safety of pharmaceuticals, plastics, other chemicals that came out of synthetic biology mid-century, so synthetic chemistry. And so I think we haven't really begun to reckon with that issue. And I just point to it in the book, really, but it's something that needs more work.
Betsy, can I say something about this? Because this is not to disagree with Bill, but I think the question you might say is of significance by itself. First, I would say that, and this is echo a little bit what Bill said. Actually, for most of its history, science has been privately funded. Okay, I think that's the first point to keep in mind. And that public funding for science is really a 20th century thing, and it has to do with the consolidation of the state, and it has been historically very much tied to state building, right, for security purposes and also for economic advantage, understood at a national level. So if we talk about Germany or Japan, right, even outside of a war context, they had a kind of scientific industrial complex going on. But all of that, the kind of situation that we've now moved into after the Cold War, which is much more devolved and much more privatized, is actually more normal from a historical standpoint, okay? What has mattered, however, from the standpoint of science becoming public knowledge, right, has been the idea that through education, people, including people who were not involved in the funding or the making of science, actually get access to it in the classroom. And so in a sense, the biggest problem that we face today isn't the fact that there's corporate funding, but it's intellectual property law, right? And it's all of those kinds of restrictions, right, which are much more heavily monitored and policed and elaborated than they were in the 19th century and prior periods, okay? And I think that's the thing to worry about more than the actual funding is the nature of the legal control that you have over the knowledge once it's been produced that makes it actually quite difficult for it to enter into the public domain, including the classroom. So I think that's the thing to keep your eye on, right? That one generally should be against intellectual property from the standpoint of science as public knowledge. Mm-hmm. Now, on the point about what you should believe and rolling Bill's ideas into the civics course, which is a great idea. The one thing I would say is that there are a lot of things where one might hold scientific views, where in a sense you might say it doesn't matter what your view is. In other words, right, most of the interesting issues in science are kind of up in the air when it gets right down to it, especially if you take a long-term perspective. What matters is when and under what circumstances do you need to take decisions based on that knowledge, right? So we don't need to know whether, we have 100% certainty whether there's anthropogenic climate change. We don't actually need to get to that point. We need to make a decision before that, right? And what kind of a decision do we need to make, right? And it seems to me, when you get the decision-making context clear, then you can figure out at what point do we need to close ranks and actually agree on something in order to have any kind of meaningful policy, right? So, but for most issues in science, I would say it is possible for there to be a lot of floating opinion, because in most issues of science, you don't need to take hard decisions, but on some issues you do. The pandemic is a good one, right? That's another example, right? There are certain issues where it doesn't matter whether you have 100% certainty or not. You actually have to take a decision based on the knowledge you have. And so it seems to me this is the kind of civics education in a way we need, right? Because we have to be able to allow that there is going to be disagreement, right? And even disagreement with the official view. But in some cases, it matters that everyone agrees. And I don't
agree. It's because what's a rational choice is a function not only of what you're justified in believing, but the outcomes. So if the outcomes are really serious, the rational thing to do might be to adopt a play it safe strategy so you don't have, the world destroyed by climate change, even though you can't agree on what the origins of climate change are. That's why I think you can say, who cares whether it's caused by humans or not? We ought to be rationally, from a point of view of action, playing it safe. We don't need
disagree. I don't disagree with this. I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't get this across to you, but
yes, you said you said we have to, in some cases, and I thought you were going to, aside climate change, come to an agreement. You did say that, and I say no, we don't.
No, we have to come to agreement from the standpoint of doing something, regardless of what explanation we give for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were saying you had.
No.
The
things that you might say, the things that are most intellectually interesting about science are the things we can be most open-minded about. But on issues that are quite practical, right, where even if we haven't resolved the big issues of what exactly is causing the climate change, we know that damage is being done, right? And at that level, it is sufficient for us to take some kind of action. Now, there's an additional question that arises, which is reversibility of the action. Okay, so in other words, we don't want to take a policy that lasts forever, right? We want to take a policy that we can monitor the consequences of that too, right? And treat the policy as itself an empirical hypothesis, right? And so, that's another issue. And Popper was very big on this idea that every policy ought to be reversible in principle within a time frame. And so we need to make policies that have that characteristic too, so that we can continue to learn, right, as we go forward. Okay, but these are all quite different issues, right? They're all quite different issues. And I think part of the public education, civic education, with regard to scientific decision-making is to distinguish these things. The things about which we can be open-minded and disagree about, and the things in which we actually need to reach a consensus for purposes of concerted action.
I think I completely agree with what Steve is saying, and I maybe could illustrate it a little bit by first with respect to climate change. There's a temptation to say, well, these couple of cranks that are saying, it's sunspots and this and that, right, that we should drum them out, right? No, I'm clear in the book that minority views, even ones that don't meet the criteria that I talk about in terms of being a viable hypothesis anymore, you leave them alone to the extent that you can, so long as the actions you're concerned about, as Steve talks about, are done, right? So from a precautionary point of view, I talk a little bit about that principle, and there's limitations to that way of thinking about it. One always has to consider if you're like, we could completely shut down the economy, right? In that, as we sort of did at the beginning of the pandemic, and that did a lot for climate emissions, right? But one has to trade off those to some extent, right? We can't just so there's issues about how you implement a precautionary perspective, but you let within science people go forward. They have the right to be wrong. And Lakatos and Fireman were very clear about that, to the point where they were discussing Arthur Jensen's view that IQ is different with respect to different racial groups. And turns out actually Lakatos was sympathetic to that view. He thought it was a progressive view. I think he was mistaken in that view, but he was sort of the neoconservative right-winger in this particular argument. Feyerabend presumably didn't think so, but what he did think was that it's not something where he was at the same university as Jensen. And he thought, what if we were talking about how politics shapes science, why not have an example right there, right? Now, we don't bring him to tell us how to fight the war on poverty, right? It's just not a credible view, right? So one can leave a view alone, one can criticize it, mark it as best you can as something that's socially pernicious and all this type of stuff, but one doesn't say, because it's socially pernicious, it must be squashed. And Lakatos made that point with respect to other philosophers that were making that kind of argument, that it was like the church, or as he knew, like the the communist state that he had been a part of and had worked for a while. So,
but a lot of these issues, about action, what drives them are not really the empirical questions for the most part. They're questions in rational decision. Should you adopt some kind of maximum theory rather than expected utility? And when it comes to morality, I would just grant, just grant for the sake of argument that blacks have a IQ that are lower than whites. So what? Does that mean they can't vote? That they shouldn't have the same education? It's right, just irrelevant.
That's literally what Feyerabend said in the letter, right? That to Lakatos is that he thought it was good to see that they're up close, and he actually advised the new left students in his class that they should go in there and argue with that teacher. They should, discuss him and argue with him, but they were too afraid they would get an F. So he said, just go in there, right?
So that's what I say to Steve, is that it's not so important to come to agreement. I'm pretty sure that's what he meant when he first stated this about we ought to come to agreement about the facts. Okay, all right, sir.
Practical agreement about what action to carry. Yeah,
okay. So, but the thing is, my point is, you don't have to pay so much attention to the facts, because what's going to trump the issue is what the rational decision principle is for deciding what to do. Shouldn't you play it safe? Forget about expected utilities. You got to play it safe when what's at stake is something extremely important. You disagree? Good. Let's have a discussion in rational decision theory. I don't care about philosophy of science now.
If I could interject, I think that conversation may take us well beyond our allotted time, and we're almost done. And if I could have the privilege of asking the final question, which is simply, Bill, can you give us a little bit of a teaser about your next project? Something that we can all be kind of sitting on the edge of our seats for.
Well, it may take a while, but
understood.
The way I tend to do things is to kind of work on multiple things at once and then see how it pans out. So part of what I'm doing is following up a little bit on the history of Lakatos and Feyerabend, and even Otto Neurath, the early logical positivist of the 1930s, and its connections with the birth of what's now called neoliberalism. So this whole idea that not only markets should control things, but that intellectual property should apply to everything, including public knowledge, really emerged in a big way as an organized movement in 1947. The Mount Pelerin Society brought together the Austrian economists that ultimately led to things like the Chicago School of Economics in the U.S. But also crucially for our field, Michael Polanyi, who was a chemist and philosopher of science that was really Kuhn before Kuhn, and more articulate and self-aware politically, I think, than Kuhn was. And his view still survives in the emphasis on tacit knowledge and expertise that's self-warranting rather than susceptible to criticism that I talked about earlier. And so how did this view emerge, and why was it so closely connected with neoliberalism? That's one thing that I'm going to look at. The other issue is sort of related to a little bit of the discussion we had, which is like, who gets credit for the metaphysics of science and how does it change, right? And I want to look at that in a sense, kind of from a big history point of view. Those of you in history may know about, the concept of big history as historians explaining, number one, beginning with the Big Bang, beginning with evolution, beginning with and explaining that history of how we got here, at the same time how we end up having a kind of knowledge of it, but with a twist, because I think if you look at a long time ago, Gerald Holton, who was another scientist turned philosopher of science, said that there were these changing themata in science. And this is kind of relates to, I think, Steve's point about metaphysics, is that things oscillate in science. The big questions tend to oscillate. So think about the Big Bang. Okay, before the Big Bang was articulated, the dominant view was that the universe had always existed. Fred Hoyle, I think, and so forth, Aristotle thought that, right? And the Big Bang has a view of the universe that it emerged in a single instance and has incredibly successful theory in terms of its predictive capacity and incredibly counterintuitive in its detail. You know, from fractions of a second, it'll tell you, you know, what was happening in the early stages of the universe. And that's, as science changes, that incredible detail doesn't go away, but it changes, the big picture changes. So now we have a view of inflation in cosmology, which says, oh, by the way, to make the whole thing finally work, we need to make the universe expand really, really quickly in a fraction of a second at the very early beginning. And if we look closely at the mathematics, that appears to suggest that, yes, our universe may have begun in an instance, but the mathematics suggests there are multiple universes. There's a multiverse, right? And there's this huge discussion and debate about this now, including about what it means for our understanding of the world, of creation, and it brings in some of these issues about materialistic versus theistic types of explanations. They kind of come back in here in a way, as some proponents talk about that. But if you believe the multiverse view, which solves certain problems that the Big Bang view had, the standard Big Bang, then the universe, the larger multiverse, has been in existence forever. And little island universes keep popping in and out of existence. And we're just in one of them that happens to support life, right? So there's a themata that goes back and forth. Is the universe infinite in time and space, or is it finite, right? And these things have oscillated even as the science has gotten better. We get these kind of metaphysical flips. And so I want to look a little bit into that issue, because I think a lot of how we have a changing conception of ourselves from science has animated a lot of philosophy, for instance, from Hegel and through to the 20th century. A lot of these Kant, obviously they're struggling with these issues, and there's a time lag effect because they're responding to commenting on science as it existed at the time and as they understood it. But there's a lot of struggle here with the issue of understanding, providing a frame of meaning for the larger view that comes out of science, especially as the science itself changes over time. And so I'm doing some preliminary stuff with that as well. So which one comes out first, probably just depends.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Good luck with that research. Something we all, and as you said, the different projects, whichever comes out first, something for us all to look forward to. For those of you who might be interested in purchasing a copy of Bill's book, Roman and Littlefield has provided a 30% discount. If you look back to the flyer for today's virtual launch, there's a link there for going on to the press website, as well as the discount code. I certainly encourage you to pick up and learn more about what Bill has been doing, researching, arguing with respect to minority reports. Concluding, I just wanted to thank both Bill and Steve for leading us today, for a very stimulating conversation. And I say that from a personal perspective. I'm a historian of modern Japan. I'm knee deep in talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so I get a little bit of science. Otherwise, I just did a unit on Japanese manga. So this really took me out of my realm, and that's one of the great things with the Humanities Center. It's programming for these virtual book launches and other things, providing scholars with an opportunity to learn something outside of their own field. So thank you all very much. Certainly appreciate your coming today. Again, Bill and Steve, thank you very much for leading us. Walter, did you want to have a final word?
No, you've said it all, and I thank the people who have attended. I'm not sure if Bill gave us the permission to post the.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
And so if that's the case, then it will appear on our website within a few days, and on YouTube simultaneously, and you can listen to the conversation and get back with Steve and and ask him more questions and keep on going. I can't resist the temptation to mention that there will be another book launch on the 19th of April, and Steve Chrysomalis from the anthropology department will have his book launched. So if you like this format and this conversation between a moderator and the author followed by questions and answers, even if you're not interested in reckonings, which is what Steve Chrysomalis' book is about, you might be able to learn about these issues from that conversation between the author and a moderator. So consider that an opportunity to learn. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you again for coming. Thank you for your questions. Again, as Walter said, if you have any follow-up with either Bill or Steve, certainly feel free to be in touch with the two of them. And again, Bill and Steve, thank you for getting us off to such a fabulous start with this new programming. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.